She weighed maybe 800 pounds when she should have weighed 1,800. Her ribs pressed against her hide like the fingers of a hand reaching out from the inside. Her hooves had grown so long they curved upward at the tips. She couldn't walk straight anymore, just shuffle forward in small, painful arcs. And the people who owned her, they lived 40 feet away. There's something about this story that I keep coming back to, and it's not the cruelty, as shocking as that is. It's what happened after. Because when a 63-year-old widow named Lenora climbed through a barbed wire fence in the middle of a cold October night with a bucket of soaked hay and a wild idea, she had absolutely no plan, no rescue organization backing her up, no legal authority on her side, just a horse who was days from dying, and the kind of stubbornness that only comes from having nothing left to lose. Before we go any further, if you've ever had an animal look at you like you were the only thing standing between them and the end, leave the name of your city in the comments. Like this video, if you believe ordinary people can do extraordinary things. And if this channel is new to you, subscribe now, because stories like this one, they don't come along very often. Now let's go back to the beginning. The town of Calverton sits in a wide, flat valley in eastern Tennessee, the kind of place where the mountains rise up on both sides like walls that keep the weather in and the people close. It's a town of maybe 4,000, if you count the farms on the outskirts, which most people do because most of the people are on those farms. Lenora Greer had lived there her entire life. She'd been born in the same county hospital where her mother had been born, gone to school at the same brick building that had been renamed twice since, and married a man named Curtis who fixed farm equipment for a living and never once complained about the smell of grease on his hands. They had a daughter, Tilda, who moved to Nashville at 22 and called every Sunday without fail. They had 17 acres of land they'd bought young and paid off slow. They had chickens, a vegetable garden, 2 cats, and a routine so familiar it had worn grooves into the days. Then Curtis died. Not dramatically, not in a way that made the local paper or brought casseroles to the door, though the casseroles did come, because that's what Calverton does. He had a heart attack on a Wednesday afternoon in the barn while he was patching a section of fence. The doctors said he probably didn't feel much. Lenora held on to that like a lifeline for months, turning it over in her mind the way you turn a stone in your pocket. That was 3 years before the horse. In the time between, Lenora had done what people do. She kept the chickens, she kept the garden, she stopped cooking real meals and started eating things from cans more often than she'd ever admit to Tilda. She walked the fence line every morning the way Curtis used to, not because anything needed checking, but because the habit felt like a form of memory she wasn't ready to give up. The property next to hers, a 40-acre parcel with a falling-down equipment shed and a pasture that had gone to thistle and scrub, had sold the year before Curtis died to a man named Voss and his brother Lyle. Nobody in Calverton knew them well. They paid cash for the place, which people noticed. They kept to themselves, which people also noticed. They ran what they called a small livestock operation, which mostly meant they bought animals cheap and sold them when the price was right and didn't spend much on anything in between. Lenora had seen their animals over the fence, goats mostly, a few pigs, a pair of mules that came and went one summer. She hadn't paid particular attention until October when she noticed the horse. The horse was a Belgian draft, or had been once. Belgians are built like monuments. When they're healthy, they're the kind of animal that makes you understand why people used to think horses were sacred. They stand 17 hands tall, broad-chested, thick-necked, their legs like columns of muscle. They pull plows and logs and fully loaded wagons without apparent effort. This horse pulled nothing. She stood at the corner of the pasture closest to Lenora's property line, and she stood there every morning, and every morning she looked a little worse. Lenora started keeping track in a small spiral notebook she found in Curtis's desk, the kind he used for parts lists and repair estimates. She wrote dates and observations in his same green pen, because it was the only one she could find. October 3rd, grey mare in the corner again. Looks thin. October 7th. She didn't move from that corner all day. Hip bones visible from the fence line. October 11th, something wrong with her feet, watching her walk. October 14th, called the county extension office. They said to call animal control. Called animal control. Left a message. October 16th, no callback. October 18th, she's leaning. When an animal leans, when they shift their weight forward onto their front legs just to get the pressure off their back ones, it means pain has become the primary fact of their existence. Lenora had seen it before, in old farm horses near the end of their lives. She recognized it the way you recognize the face of something you hoped you wouldn't see again. She put down the green pen. She went inside. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time, in the way that means a person is not thinking, but deciding. Then she got up, put on her boots, and went to the barn to see what she had. What she had wasn't much. A wheelbarrow with a slow leak in one tire. 3 50-pound bags of dried corn that she'd been meaning to give to a neighbor. A partial bale of Timothy hay left over from when they'd briefly kept a goat the summer before Curtis passed. A metal water trough, cracked along one side but still holding. And tools, Curtis's tools, which were everywhere, organized in a way that only made sense if you were Curtis, but organized nonetheless. Lenora had kept them exactly as he'd left them. She stood in the barn for a long time with a flashlight, pointing the beam at things and thinking. Then she walked the fence line between her property and Voss's, the way she did every morning, except this time she was looking at it differently. She was looking for gaps. She found one near the southeast corner where a fence post had rotted at the base and leaned inward. The barbed wire had gone loose in 3 places, sagging low enough that something small might have been able to slip under. But not a horse, not even a sick one. But Lenora wasn't thinking about the horse going under. She was thinking about what she might be able to bring over. She went back inside and called her veterinarian, a man named Dr. Owens, who had a practice outside of Calverton and had treated the Greer's animals for 20 years. He picked up on the 3rd ring, which was unusual for 9 at night, and Lenora counted it as the first small piece of luck in a story that was about to need several. She described what she'd seen. Dr. Owens was quiet for a moment. "How long's she been out there?" he asked. "I don't know exactly. I started watching in early October, but she might have been there before I noticed." "What do her hooves look like?" Lenora described the curl. The way the horse walked in small arcs instead of straight lines. Dr. Owens was quiet again. "That's months of neglect minimum, possibly longer." A pause. "You call animal control?" "Left a message 5 days ago." He exhaled. "Here's the thing, Lenora. Animal control can act if there's a complaint on record and they have cause to believe the animal is in immediate danger. The problem is their response time can be variable. Especially for horses. Horses are property. The law moves slow." "How slow?" "Slow enough that this horse might not be alive by the time anybody official shows up with paperwork." There it was. Lenora had known it, but she'd needed to hear someone else say it. "What if I fed her through the fence?" she asked. "You'd be trespassing on their property if you crossed the line." "What if I stayed on my side of the fence?" A longer pause this time. "You'd need to do it right." "Soaked hay. Beet pulp if you can get it. Not straight grain, it could founder her. Water if you can manage it. And Lenora," his voice changed slightly, "they see you doing it. It could get complicated. I know. You do this. Call me in the morning. I want to know what you're dealing with." She hung up and went to the kitchen and wrote down everything he'd told her. Then she called Alma, her closest neighbor, a woman of 70 who had helped Lenora plant the spring garden and who had the kind of practical wisdom that comes from living alone on a farm for 40 years. Alma listened without interrupting, which was one of the reasons Lenora called her. "Don't go tonight," Alma said when Lenora was finished. "Go tomorrow at first light. Voss and his brother run town errands on Wednesday mornings. I've seen their truck leave by 7 every week. You'll have time." "How do you know their schedule?" "Because I watch, Lenora. Watching is what old women do when nobody thinks we're doing anything." It was Wednesday tomorrow. Lenora set her alarm for 5:30 and went to bed and lay in the dark until 4, when she gave up and started making soaked hay. She mixed it the way Dr. Owens had told her. Warm water, the Timothy hay broken apart, a cup of the dried beet pulp she'd found miraculously in a bag Curtis had stored on the high shelf for the goat. She filled a 5-gallon bucket with the mixture and let it sit, and she filled a second bucket with clean water, and she carried both of them down to the southeast corner of the fence, while the sky was still the particular dark blue that comes just before the light starts. The horse was there. Of course she was. This was her corner. This was the edge of things. She heard Lenora coming before she saw her, lifted her head slowly, like the effort cost something, and Lenora stopped walking and waited. The horse stood still. Lenora took one step, then another. Then she set the buckets down on her side of the fence, as close to the lowest sagging wire as she could manage, and she sat down on the cold ground beside them. And she waited. It took 20 minutes. 20 minutes of nothing happening, the two of them in the cold blue dark with the fence between them. And then the horse took one shuffling step forward, then another, and lowered her head to the bucket of soaked hay and ate. Lenora didn't move, didn't speak, didn't cry, though she wanted to. She just stayed. When the bucket was empty and the horse had drunk half the water, Lenora reached through the lowest wire with one hand, carefully, slowly, the way you do when you're not asking for anything, and she rested her fingers against the horse's nose. The horse didn't pull away. Lenora named her Belle right then, sitting in the mud in the dark, because it was the first thing that came to mind, and because sometimes the right name comes before any explanation does. By the following Monday, Lenora had established a routine precise enough to run a military operation. 5:15, alarm. 5:30, first batch of soaked feed prepared. 6:10, down to the fence corner before any reasonable person was awake. She stayed until the light came up fully, which gave her about an hour before she needed to be back inside. Voss's truck left between 6:50 and 7:10, which gave her a narrow window she trusted entirely to Alma's surveillance. Alma, for her part, had started texting Lenora whenever she saw the truck move. Her texts were brief and factual. Truck left 6:58, or both of them, heading toward town. Lenora saved everyone. Belle was eating. That was the first thing, and for the first week, it was the only thing that mattered. A horse that size, that depleted, needed to come back slowly. Dr. Owens had been clear about that. Too much too fast, and you risked refeeding problems, which could kill an already compromised animal as surely as the starvation itself. So Lenora kept the portions modest, increased them gradually, and spent the time between feedings reading everything she could find about draft horse rehabilitation. She did this on Curtis's old laptop at the kitchen table, wearing her reading glasses with a yellow legal pad beside her for notes. She learned things she hadn't known. She learned that Belgian drafts can live well into their late 20s if cared for properly. She learned that hooves as overgrown as Belle's would need a farrier. Not just a trim, but a corrective series of trims spaced weeks apart to gradually restore the natural angle. She learned about body scoring systems, muscle atrophy, the way long-term malnutrition affects a horse's organs, the extraordinary resilience of these animals when given half a chance. She also learned, in a county agricultural forum she found through a search, that a man named Voss, no first name given, had been flagged in 2 neighboring counties in the previous 4 years for animal welfare complaints. Neither complaint had resulted in formal charges. One had been dismissed due to insufficient evidence. The other was listed as pending resolution, which meant nothing at all. Lenora printed that page and put it in a folder. The folder grew. Animal Control's call, finally returned 6 days after her initial message by a woman named Deputy Clarice, who was apologetic and practical, and explained that a formal investigation required a supervisor's sign-off and that the supervisor was currently managing a situation in the next county over. Deputy Clarice took Lenora's description, noted the prior complaints Lenora mentioned, and said she'd flag it as urgent. She sounded like she meant it. How urgent? Lenora asked. I'll be honest with you, horses are harder than dogs. With dogs, there's a lot of public sympathy, a lot of infrastructure. With horses, the laws vary more, and there's more grey area around what constitutes adequate care. If she's still on her feet and not actively collapsing, they'll say she's ambulatory, and that changes the timeline. She is on her feet, Lenora said. Barely. Document it. Photos, dated. Video if you can. The more documentation you have, the faster this moves. Lenora didn't own a smartphone. She called Tilda that evening and described the situation, and Tilda said, without hesitation, "I'm coming Saturday," and arrived Friday night with a newer phone she'd bought specifically for this purpose, still in its box. "You didn't need to buy a new..." "Mama." Tilda set down her bag and looked at her mother. "You're feeding a dying horse through a barbed wire fence at 5 in the morning. I bought a phone." They went to the fence together in the cold Saturday dawn. Belle was there. She was, in fact, slightly less sunken-looking than she had been. A small change, the kind you'd only notice if you'd been watching carefully, which both of them had. Tilda took photographs. She took them from Lenora's side of the fence, careful to stay off Voss's property, and she took them in sequence. Belle's profile, her ribs, her hooves, her eyes, the fence, the distance to the house beyond. She took a short video of Belle walking, which documented the hoof issue more clearly than anything Lenora could have described. They uploaded everything to a secure folder that Tilda set up on her phone. "I want to send these to someone," Tilda said. "There's an organization. I looked it up on the drive down. They're called Appalachian Draft Rescue. They've done this before." Lenora looked at the photos on the small screen, Belle's ribs in the morning light, the curled hooves against the dead grass. "Send them," she said. The response came the next morning, a Sunday, from a woman named Fern, who identified herself as the intake coordinator. Fern's email was 3 paragraphs long and contained more specific information about Belgian draft rehabilitation than anything Lenora had found on her own. It also contained a question: is there a realistic possibility of removal from the property? And if so, do you have a place to house her short term? Lenora stared at that question for a long time. She had 17 acres. She had a barn with 4 empty stalls. She had a pasture that was overgrown but fenced. She had all of Curtis's tools and all of his patience, which she'd absorbed over 40 years by proximity. She wrote back, yes to both. What she didn't write, because she didn't know it yet, was that saying yes to those 2 questions was going to put her directly in the path of Voss, a county deputy, a local magistrate, and a story that would end up in the regional newspaper under a headline she would later describe as more dramatic than strictly necessary. But that was coming. First, she had to get Belle out. Fern arrived on a Wednesday morning in a truck that looked like it had driven across half the Appalachians, which it had. She was somewhere in her early 50s, with sun-weathered hands and the kind of direct eye contact that comes from years of assessing animals and people in rapid succession. She shook Lenora's hand at the door, accepted a cup of coffee, declined a chair, and said, "Show me." They walked the fence line together. Fern didn't say much, just looked. She looked at the fence, at the house visible on the far side of the property, at the shed, at the scrub pasture. Then she looked at Belle, who was in her corner, and her expression changed in the way that professionals try to prevent but can't always manage. "How long have you been feeding her?" Fern asked. 11 days. Fern looked at her. "You can see it." She meant the change, however small. "Another 2 weeks, and she might have been too far gone." They walked back to Lenora's barn. Fern looked at the stalls, checked the water lines, counted the bales of hay Lenora had bought on Dr. Owens's recommendation. She nodded slowly. "Here's where we are," Fern said, setting her coffee mug on the workbench. "What you're describing is a horse that is legally the property of your neighbor. Animal control has an open investigation. Until that investigation results in a seizure order or the owner surrenders the animal, we cannot move her. Technically." Lenora had been expecting the word technically. "What does technically mean in practice?" she asked. It means there are situations where a horse is in such acute distress that an emergency petition can be filed. I've done it. It takes a cooperating veterinarian, a formal written assessment, documented evidence of imminent risk of death, and a magistrate willing to sign off before close of business. Fern paused. It also takes someone on the ground willing to be named in the petition. Name me, Lenora said. Fern looked at her steadily. It could create legal exposure for you if Voss decides to push back. He could argue you were interfering with his property, that the feeding confused the animal's condition. He let her starve for months. I know, but the law doesn't always follow the logic we'd prefer it to. Name me, Lenora said again. Dr. Owens came out that afternoon. He examined Belle from Lenora's side of the fence as much as he could, then called the county animal control supervisor directly, a different person than Deputy Clarice, a man named Superintendent Holt, who, Dr. Owens later reported, listened longer than I expected. He filed his written assessment that evening from his car in Lenora's driveway, emailed it to 3 recipients, and then walked back to the house and told Lenora he had never, in 30 years of practice, done anything like that before. Good, Lenora said. She handed him a piece of cornbread. Meanwhile, Alma had provided something unexpected. Alma had been watching Voss and Lyle's property for 2 weeks now, with the focused attention of a woman who had decided she was done being a passive observer. She had, without telling Lenora, begun a written log of her own. Times, truck movements, whether lights were on, whether she saw either man near the pasture. She had also, as it turned out, a grandson named Breck, who was a staff photographer for the Calverton Valley Courier and who had been visiting the previous weekend. Breck's photographs, taken with a telephoto lens from a public road, showed Belle in the pasture with an objectivity that no one could argue with. They showed the hooves, they showed the ribs, they showed the distance to the house. They showed, incidentally, Voss standing on his porch on a Sunday morning with a cup of coffee, in clear view of the pasture. Alma handed Lenora the photographs on Thursday morning with the gravity of someone presenting evidence to a court. Alma, Lenora said carefully, did you ask Breck to do this? I asked him if he was interested in a story. He said yes. I said come for dinner. She shrugged. He's a good boy. The Courier didn't run the story right away. There was an editorial process, and the editor, a cautious man, wanted to make sure the legal situation was clearer before publishing. But the photographs existed, and they were sitting in a folder on the paper's server, and the editor had called the County Animal Control Office for comment, which meant the County Animal Control Office knew a newspaper was paying attention. By Friday morning, Superintendent Holt had signed off on an emergency inspection. By Friday afternoon, he had seen Belle in person. By Friday at 4:15, he had called Voss and informed him that the county was exercising its authority under Tennessee Code annotated 44-17-403 to impound the animal pending a welfare determination. Voss, according to Deputy Clarice, who called Lenora to let her know, was not pleased but did not resist. Lyle apparently said nothing at all. The county trailer came at 5 on Friday evening. Lenora stood at her fence and watched it back up to the gate. She watched Deputy Clarice and a second officer enter the pasture. She watched Belle be approached gently by people in reflective vests, and then she realized she'd been clutching the top fence wire so hard that it had left a line across her palm. She loosened her grip. The trailer left just after 6, with Belle loaded. Slowly, carefully, with a long pause at the ramp because Belle didn't trust it, and then a patient, wordless 10 minutes of just standing there until she did. Fern had been there too, inside the pasture, talking to Belle in a low voice the whole time. Lenora watched until the truck turned at the road. Then she went inside and called Tilda. She's out, she said. Tilda was quiet for a moment. Where is she going? The county facility for now. Fern says 2 weeks, maybe 3, and then she can come here for rehabilitation. Here, Tilda repeated. To your barn, that's what I said. Tilda was quiet again, and then she laughed, the kind of laugh that has relief in it. Mama, what are you doing? Lenora looked out the kitchen window toward the empty pasture on the far side of the fence. "I'm not sure yet," she said honestly, "but I think I'm just getting started." 2 weeks turned into 3, then 4. The county facility wasn't equipped for long-term horse rehabilitation. It was designed for intake and holding, not for the slow, careful work of bringing a severely depleted animal back to something like health. Fern made the case to Superintendent Holt that transferring Belle to Lenora's property under a formal fostering agreement with Appalachian Draft Rescue was the better option for the animal. Holt agreed, provided Lenora sign the paperwork and allow monthly inspections. Lenora signed without reading the second page, which Tilda would later scold her for. Belle arrived at Lenora's barn on a Tuesday in November on a cold afternoon with low grey clouds that couldn't decide whether to rain or not. The transport was a different trailer this time, Appalachian Draft Rescue's own rig, a newer model with rubber floor mats and padded dividers. Fern came with it, and she brought a young woman named Sable, who was a certified equine rehabilitation specialist and had the energy of someone who could work a 16-hour day and still ask whether anyone needed anything. Sable walked the barn, examined the stalls, tested the water pressure, checked the hay, asked about the pasture drainage, and within 20 minutes had produced a handwritten rehabilitation schedule that was more detailed than anything Lenora had seen outside of a hospital discharge plan. Week 1, stall rest, soaked feeds every 4 hours, no pasture access, Sable said, handing Lenora the paper. Week 2, supervised short walks, just around the barn, 5 minutes, 3 times a day. We're rebuilding everything, muscle, gut function, hoof integrity. This is going to be slow. I have time, Lenora said. Sable looked at her with the slightly assessing expression of someone used to dealing with volunteers whose enthusiasm outpaced their capacity. Then she seemed to find what she was looking for. "I know you do," she said, and it wasn't patronizing. The farrier came that first week. A man named Birch, who had been working with Fern's organization for years, and who arrived with a truck full of specialized rasps and blocks, and the particular silence of someone who had seen bad hooves before and had learned not to editorialize. He spent 3 hours with Belle in the cross ties Lenora had rigged from the barn beams, talking to her the whole time in a low, even voice. He didn't fix the hooves that day. That was the thing Lenora had to understand. You don't fix hooves like that in a day. You begin the correction, and then you come back in 6 weeks, and then again in 6 weeks after that, and each time the angle shifts a little closer to right. It was a long project. Everything about Belle was a long project, but she was eating. That was the first fact and the constant fact. Every 4 hours, Lenora set the alarm and went to the barn with the soaked feed. And every 4 hours, Belle was waiting, her head turned toward the stall door in anticipation. That anticipation, the small, patient turn of her head, was the thing Lenora held onto in the hard moments, because there were hard moments. In early December, Belle developed a fever. Not severe, not immediately dangerous, but enough that Dr. Owens came out twice in 3 days, and Lenora spent 2 nights in the barn with a sleeping bag on the hay, getting up every 2 hours to check the temperature and log it in the notebook. The notebook, Curtis's notebook, the one with the green pen, had by now been entirely filled with Belle's story, dates, weights, observations, temperatures, hoof angles, feeding amounts. Lenora had started a second notebook. The fever broke on the 3rd night. Lenora was sitting in the hay when it happened. She knew because she took the temperature at 2:15 in the morning, and it had dropped back to normal, and she sat there in the quiet barn with the thermometer in her hand and felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years. Not happiness exactly, something quieter, something closer to purpose. She wrote in the notebook, Deck, 14th, 2:15 a.m. Fever broke. She's going to be okay. The Courier ran the story in mid-December. The editor had waited for the legal situation to fully resolve. A hearing had been held in the 3rd week of November, and the magistrate had issued a formal finding of animal cruelty against Voss, with Lyle named as a contributing party. Voss was fined and prohibited from owning livestock for 5 years. Lyle's case was deferred, pending a separate proceeding that Lenora frankly lost track of. The Courier headline was, "Calverton Widow Rescues Draft Horse After Months of Neglect. Legal Action Follows." Alma had called it adequate. What Lenora hadn't expected was what happened after the story ran. The calls started the day of publication. People from Calverton, from neighboring towns, from places she'd never heard of, a woman from Knoxville who wanted to donate hay, a retired farrier from Greenville offering to assist Birch with the corrective work at no charge, a man who identified himself as a Belgian draft breeder in Virginia and wanted to know if Belle had any identifying markings, which led to a separate and unexpected chapter of the story that would take weeks to fully unfold. And a family, a couple named Hadley and Cress, with 2 daughters under 12, who drove 3 hours to stand at Lenora's barn door on a Saturday morning and ask if they could just see her. Lenora brought them in. The girls stood in the stall doorway and looked at Belle with the kind of reverence that children have before they learn to perform it. And the older one reached out slowly, the same way Lenora had reached through the wire in the dark, and Belle lowered her head and let herself be touched. Hadley looked at Lenora. "How did you know to do this?" she asked. Not the rescue. Hadley seemed to understand that. The how, the patience of it. Lenora thought about that. "I didn't know," she said finally. "I just didn't stop." The call from the Virginia breeder, a man named Gareth, came on a Thursday evening in the second week of December, 4 days after the Courier story ran online, and was shared widely enough that it crossed state lines. Gareth was methodical on the phone. He'd seen the photographs in the article. He had a database of registered Belgians going back 15 years. He wanted to know, was the horse branded? Any markings on the left shoulder? A notch in the right ear? Lenora had not looked for a brand. She went to the barn with her phone. Tilda had finally convinced her to get a smartphone of her own, and Lenora had spent 2 weeks being confused by it and was now begrudgingly competent. And she went to Belle's stall and looked. There was a brand. Under the winter coat she'd been growing in, barely visible now that her condition had improved enough for the hair to thicken on the left shoulder, a small set of characters she'd assumed was just an old scar. She photographed it and sent it to Gareth. He called back in 20 minutes. "Her registered name is Hartfield Blue Belle," he said. "She was bred at a farm in Western Virginia and sold at a livestock auction approximately 4 years ago. The buyer's records are incomplete." A pause. "She was sold twice more after that from what I can find. The trail goes cold about 18 months before she ended up with your neighbors." Lenora sat down on the hay bale outside Belle's stall. "Does she have a previous owner who—" "Her original breeder passed away," Gareth said, not unkindly. "His daughter, a woman named Roselle, has been trying to track several of his animals for years. She knows some of them went to bad situations. She's going to want to know about this one." A Roselle called the next day. She was somewhere in her 40s, with a voice that went unsteady at certain moments and then steadied itself deliberately. She had grown up with Belgians. Her father, she called him just Dad, not by name, had bred them for 20 years and kept meticulous records. When he died, the farm had been sold, but Roselle had kept copies of every registration, every sale record, every veterinary note. Blue Belle had been born on the farm on a spring morning 11 years ago. Roselle had been there. She described the foal's markings, the star on the forehead, slightly off-center to the left, which Lenora could confirm. And her voice went unsteady again when she said it, and this time she didn't try to steady it. "Is she going to be all right?" Roselle asked. "Yes," Lenora said. And then, because she'd learned something in the past 2 months about making claims she couldn't fully guarantee, "I believe so. She's eating well. She's moving better. She has more to go, but she's going in the right direction. Can I come see her?" "Come whenever you want." Roselle came on a Saturday in January, driving 7 hours from Western Virginia in a truck that had a Belgians Forever sticker on the rear window that had been there long enough to fade. She was a compact woman with dark eyes, and her father's hands, wide across the knuckles, weathered. And when she walked into the barn and Belle turned her head, Roselle stopped moving entirely. Lenora hung back at the door. She watched Roselle stand still in the barn aisle for a long moment, and then walk forward slowly and reach up, and Belle put her head down the same way she'd put it down for Lenora in the cold dark back in October, and Roselle put her face against Belle's neck and stayed there. Lenora went back to the house and made coffee. She didn't cry. She would have said she wasn't a crier. But she stood at the kitchen sink and looked out at the bare winter garden and felt something shift in her chest. Something that had been lodged in a particular position for 3 years and had, very quietly, moved. Later, over coffee at the kitchen table, Roselle told her more about the farm, about her father, who had loved these horses the way some people love music, not for utility, but for what they were. About the years after his death, when she'd tried to find the horses that had been sold off, which was mostly an exercise in frustration and partial information. "I found 3, Roselle said. 2 were fine. 1, she stopped. 1 wasn't. "I'm sorry," Lenora said. "Blue Bell makes 4. Roselle turned her mug in her hands. "My dad he would have been—" She shook her head. "There isn't a word for it." Lenora thought about Curtis, about how he would have been out there in October probably before she was the one who walked the fence, but he was the one who actually looked at things. He had that quality of seeing. She had learned it, or something like it, by proximity and time, and then by necessity. "Tell me about him," she said. So Roselle did, and Lenora talked about Curtis. And they sat at the kitchen table while the winter light moved across the floor, and outside in the barn, a horse who had been called Blue Bell for the first 11 years of her life, and Bell for the last 2 months, was standing in a clean stall with good hay and clean water and hooves that were, week by week, finding their right angle. When Roselle left at 4 in the afternoon, she turned at the truck door. "I want to ask you something," she said. "You don't have to say yes." Lenora waited. "When she's fully rehabilitated, when she's actually well, I'd like to bring her back to Virginia, to land she knows, land that was her mother's land." Roselle paused. "But I want it to be your decision, because she's yours now, in every way that matters." Lenora looked at the barn. She thought about October, the dark, the bucket of soaked hay, the 20 minutes of waiting, the nose under her hand. She thought about what Tilda had asked. "What are you doing, Mama?" She thought about what she'd answered. "I'm not sure yet." She was sure now. "She belongs on that land," Lenora said. "We both know it." Roselle nodded. She looked like she'd been prepared to argue, and was surprised not to need to. "There's something else," Roselle said. "I want to do this in spring, when she's truly ready, and I want you to come." She paused. "Not just to bring her, to see it, to see where she came from." Lenora hadn't been to Virginia in 20 years, hadn't been more than 100 miles from Calverton in 3, hadn't, if she was honest, been fully present anywhere in 3 years, not in the sense of arriving somewhere and finding it interesting, finding it capable of holding her. "All right," she said. Spring came early that year, or maybe it just seemed early, because Lenora was paying attention to it in a way she hadn't in a long time. Belle's weight had normalized by February. Birch came for his 3rd corrective trim in March and stood back when he was finished and said, "She's walking right," in the tone of a man who had learned not to overstate things. Sable had moved Belle from short, supervised walks to full pasture access in February, and the first time Lenora turned her out, Belle stood at the gate for a minute, just stood there, looking at the space, and then walked into it. Not running, not skittish, just walking with a new kind of deliberateness. Lenora watched from the fence, the same fence she'd been watching from since October. Dr. Owens did a final wellness assessment the last week of March. He moved through it methodically. Eyes, teeth, heart, lungs, hooves, weight, movement. And at the end, he looked at Lenora over his reading glasses. "She's good," he said. "She's genuinely good." Lenora wrote it in the notebook. March 28th. Dr. Owen's final assessment. "She's genuinely good." She had filled 4 notebooks by this point. She had started the first one with Curtis's green pen, which had run out of ink somewhere in January, and she'd replaced it with a blue pen and then a black pen. The notebooks sat on the kitchen shelf in a row, and she was aware of something slightly strange when she looked at them, that she had documented this experience more thoroughly than anything in her life since the farm's own records, which Curtis had kept. Maybe she had been keeping records for him. Maybe she had needed something to keep records for. Tilda came home the first weekend of April to help with the transport preparation. She was practical about it in the way she was practical about most things. Organized, efficient, slightly louder than the situation required, and also visibly moved in the way she was visibly moved about most things involving her mother, which she would deny if asked. They cleaned the trailer together. They packed the hay and the grain and the supplements. They drove out to Roselle's land in Virginia in convoy. Lenora in the truck with the trailer, Tilda following in her own car, a caravan of 2 for something that felt larger than 2 cars could contain. The land in Virginia was beautiful. Lenora hadn't been prepared for how beautiful. Rolling hills, still brown with late winter, but with the first green pressing through at the edges of the fields. Fencing that went on for what felt like miles. Solid, maintained, the kind of fencing that means someone has been paying attention to it for a very long time. Roselle was waiting at the gate. She had 2 people with her. A neighbor, she explained, and her cousin Marion, who had helped on the farm and was apparently incapable of missing this moment. Marion had a camera with a long lens. She had clearly been crying already and was not apologizing for it. They unloaded Belle slowly. She walked down the ramp with the careful, considered movement of a horse who had learned to trust ramps, and she stood in the gravel drive and lifted her head and breathed the air. Roselle walked to her, didn't say anything, just walked to her, the way you walk to something you've been missing for years without a word for it. They put Belle in the pasture at the back of the property. The original pasture, Roselle said, where Bluebell's mother had lived. The grass was just coming in. Belle walked the fence line first, the way horses do, learning the boundaries of a new place. Then she stopped near the center of the field and dropped her head and started to graze. Marion was crying openly. Tilda, who had also been crying and was also not apologizing for it, put her arm around Lenora. Lenora watched the horse graze. She thought, this is what comes after. Not the loss, not the hollow quiet of a house without someone in it, not the years of watching the fence line out of habit, not even the rescue as necessary as it was. This, the horse in the right field, on the right land, grazing in the spring light. The idea that something can be badly broken and then, with time and attention and stubbornness, become something whole again. She thought about Curtis. Not with the sharp edge of grief, but with something softer. Recognition, maybe. The sense that he would have stood here at this fence in this light and felt exactly what she felt. She stayed until the sun moved far enough that the light changed. 6 months later, Lenora got a letter. It was handwritten. She noticed that first, because handwritten letters almost never came anymore. On plain white stationery, with a return address in Calverton she recognized as belonging to a family named Jessup, who lived about 3 miles down the road. She didn't know them well. She knew the name, the way you know names in a town of 4,000. The letter was from a woman named Ray Jessup, who wrote in neat, careful cursive that she had read the story in the Courier and had thought about it often. She had, she wrote, a situation of her own. An elderly mule on a neighboring property, declining, and owners who seemed indifferent at best. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know if there was anything she could do. She had written to Lenora, because the article suggested Lenora might know. Lenora read the letter twice. Then she called Fern. "I have a situation," she said. Fern laughed, not unkindly. "You're going to keep doing this, aren't you?" "I don't know yet," Lenora said, "but I know who to call." What followed was not as dramatic as Belle's story. The mule situation turned out to be resolvable through conversation with the owners rather than legal intervention, a fact that Lenora filed away as a useful reminder that not every situation required crossing a fence in the dark. But the process brought Lenora into contact with the network Fern had built over years. Veterinarians, farriers, rehabilitators, volunteers, the overlapping web of people who paid attention to animals the way Alma paid attention to truck schedules. She became part of it, not in an official capacity at first. She attended a regional meeting that winter, held in a church fellowship hall in a town 40 minutes from Calverton, and sat in the back and mostly listened, the way she'd learned to do in barns. She drove Fern to 2 farm calls in March when Fern's truck needed repairs. She provided temporary housing for a pair of neglected goats in April, using the skills she'd accumulated during Belle's rehabilitation. She answered 3 emails from people who'd found her name through the Courier article, all of them in situations similar to the one she'd been in. Neighbors with animals they were worried about and no idea what the process looked like. She knew what the process looked like. Roselle sent photographs. Belle in the spring pasture, heavier now, glossy, standing with her head up in the way that healthy horses stand when they're actually comfortable in their bodies. Weight forward, ears relaxed. Belle in the summer, grazing with a second Belgian Roselle had acquired, an older gelding named something Lenora couldn't pronounce and didn't try to. Belle in the fall, which was the most recent photograph, taken from the same fence where Roselle had stood in January, and the light in it was the same low autumn light that had been in Calverton when this whole thing started. Lenora kept that photograph on the kitchen windowsill above the sink. She'd framed it herself in a plain wooden frame she'd found in Curtis's workshop, still in its packaging. She also kept the notebooks. All 4 of them, plus the 5th, which was half filled now with a different kind of record, not a horse's recovery, but something harder to name. Notes from the regional meetings, contact information, the name of a good farrier in the next county, observations about what worked and what didn't, when dealing with animal control, with neighbors, with people who owned animals they shouldn't have owned and couldn't quite be made to understand that. Tilda came home for Thanksgiving and picked up the 5th notebook from the shelf and leafed through it. "You've become a whole operation," she said. "I haven't become anything," Lenora said. "I'm just writing things down." But she knew that wasn't entirely true. There was a phrase she'd heard at one of the network meetings from a woman named Petra, who'd been doing this work for 30 years and was now training the next generation of people. And the phrase was, "Once you know how to look, you can't stop." Lenora had thought about that phrase many times since. She had spent years walking the fence line out of habit, out of memory, out of the need to be doing something with her body while her mind worked through the weight of missing a person. And then she had started looking, and it turned out, as Petra would have told her, as anyone in that network would have told her, that there was always something to see. There was always something at the corner of the field, something that needed someone to stop and notice and decide not to walk past. The decision not to walk past was the whole thing. She understood that now. Bluebell, Belle, is 11 years old now, living on Virginia farmland where her mother lived before her. Her hooves are correct. Her weight is right. She has a companion and a pasture and a woman who knew her father's name. She has all of this because a widow in eastern Tennessee looked through a fence one October morning and saw something that needed seeing. Here's what I think about at the end of this story. We talk a lot about what it takes to help, the resources, the authority, the credentials, the systems, and those things matter. The farrier matters. The veterinarian matters. The organization with the trailer and the intake coordinator matters. The deputy who actually showed up matters. But Lenora had none of that when she walked to the fence. She had a bucket of soaked hay and 20 minutes of cold, patient waiting. That was the beginning of everything. There are people in your life, maybe right now, in your neighborhood, on the other side of whatever fence runs beside your property, who are at the corner of the field, who are leaning, who have been there long enough that you've started to think of them as just part of the landscape. Look again. If this story made you feel something, leave it in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us about the animal, or the person, or the thing you noticed once and couldn't stop noticing. We read every comment, every single one. Like this video if you believe that ordinary people with ordinary things can do something extraordinary, because this story proves that they can. Subscribe if you're new here, and come back next time because we have more stories like this one. Until then, keep looking.